Mark chapter 5 is an interesting story of Jesus healing the daughter of a man named Jairus. Jairus comes up to Jesus and he says to Jesus, "My daughter is ill. Please come and lay your hands on her so you can heal her." And Jesus starts to go to see the girl, but he's interrupted on the way. And before he can get to the house, some servants come from the house and they tell Jairus, "Don't worry because she's dead already and there's no reason to bother the master anymore." Jesus says, "That's not a problem," and he goes to the house. She's dead now, but he raises her from the dead. Beautiful story in Mark chapter 5. Matthew also tells the story in Matthew chapter 9. But in Matthew chapter 9, when Jairus comes to Jesus, he says to him, "My daughter has just died. Can you do something?" Now, wait a second. Now, in Mark's gospel, the girl hadn't died yet. She was sick, but she died when Jesus was delayed. But in Matthew, she's dead already. Well, which is it? Now, many of you are saying, who cares? Well, it's a little detail. But why is it different? It couldn't be both. It couldn't be both. It has to be one or the other or neither. There are hundreds and hundreds of examples like that, many of them small, picayune, some of them rather significant. The birth of Jesus is recounted in two of our Gospels, Matthew and Luke. They're both very interesting accounts. One of the most interesting things is that they are completely at odds with one another. Sometime simply read through Matthew chapters 1 and 2 and list everything that happens, and then read through Luke chapters 1 and 2 and list everything that happens and compare your lists. You don't have to take it from me or from anyone else, just do it yourself. They tell many different stories, and sometimes they tell the same story differently. In both accounts, Jesus has a genealogy. The genealogy in Luke happens to come in chapter 3 after Jesus' birth, which is a strange place for a genealogy, but that's where it is. Luke chapter 3. Read the genealogy in Luke and read the genealogy in Matthew and ask yourself, who is allegedly Jesus' father in both? Well, it's Joseph, okay? Both genealogy traces Joseph's bloodline. And so, who is Joseph's father? It's different in Matthew and Luke. Who's his grandfather? Different in Matthew and Luke. Who's his great-grandfather? Different in Matthew and Luke. The genealogies are different between Joseph all the way back to King David. And both genealogies claim to be giving the genealogy of Joseph. Why is that? Well, they probably had different sources, and, they probably didn't know. They had sources that gave them genealogy. Genealogies are odds, but they can't be historically accurate because they're different. You have one father. You don't have two fathers. Well, maybe he was adopted by somebody, and so he had a stepfather. Yeah, maybe. The death of Jesus. Both Mark, our earliest gospel, and John, our latest gospel, agree that Jesus died sometime during the Passover feast in Jerusalem, the annual celebration of the Passover. The Jews, of course, continue to celebrate today. Mark is quite explicit. Our first gospel is explicit. Jesus has a Passover meal with his disciples. Afterwards, he goes out and he's arrested. When Judas betrays him, he spends the night in jail, and he's put on the cross the next morning at 9 o'clock a.m., the morning after the Passover meal was eaten. John, our latest gospel, is also quite explicit. There's no word about Jesus and the disciples having a Passover meal. Jesus goes out and he's arrested. He spends the night in jail. He's put on trial, and Pontius Pilate condemns him to death afternoon, not at 9 o'clock, afternoon on the day before the Passover meal was to be eaten. John 19, verse 14 says it explicitly. Well, did he eat the Passover meal or not? In Mark, yes. In John, no. They can't both be right. He didn't get crucified at two different times. He got crucified once. Well, which day was it? They both can't be right. There are discrepancies in the resurrection narratives of the New Testament. I have my disciples, my disciples at Chapel Hill, do this assignment every year. Just read what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John say about the resurrection and make a list of what each one says and compare your list. Who goes to the tomb? Is it one woman or several women? What are their names? It depends which gospel you read. Was the stone already rolled away before they got there? It depends which gospel you read. What did they see there? Did they see a man there? Did they see two men there? Or did they see an angel there? It depends which gospel you read. What were they told to do? Depends which gospel you read. Did they do it? Depends which gospel you read. Were the disciples supposed to go to Galilee to see Jesus and they did so? Or were they ordered not to leave Jerusalem? And they did so. These are discrepancies. They're not simply differences. Why? Because they are different stories. But if they're different, they can't be accurate.